Thank you. Welcome again. Puja, David, Bianca, welcome.
You.
Misogyny, probably one of the messiest, hardest challenges that we can solve. Puja, it'd be great just to give us some context, a background to the challenge, why we chose to address it when we did.
Yeah, of course. So kind of where we began is that in the UK, a woman is killed by a man every 3 days. And that is shocking. And for us, that was the starting point, was how do we prevent this epidemic of violence against women and girls? And is there a role that a campaign could play in that? And this kind of all started with kind of what our first and our key insight was, which is that low-level misogyny is usually a precursor to more violent crime. So it's very rare that a violent crime against women will happen without there having been some clues or some instances of misogyny or something that showed misogynistic attitudes or beliefs. And that's backed up by crime stats. We see things like exhibitionist behaviour, so exposing yourself without consent. 5 to 10% of those tend to progress to contact sexual harassment. So we know that kind of that misogyny is a really early indicator. And when thinking about this, we knew a campaign at the kind of sharper end isn't going to work. You can't, when somebody's already reached that perpetrator level, a campaign isn't going to stop that crime from happening. But how can we kind of reach it at the earlier point and think about that kind of preventative side of things? And also, we really wanted to engage men in the solution. So the majority of men who are not perpetrators, how can they be involved and engaged and kind of giving them positive opportunity to be able to tackle that culture and kind of basically stop it before it happens? How do we shift it so that misogyny doesn't feel acceptable in those social situations? So that was kind of where we started. And there were 2 phases planned within the campaign. And the first one was really about the awareness and the motivation of why. So how do we make the problem known, understood, felt, and also the solution of being able to have a word? How do we make that understood, and then men understand why do I need to have a word? How can I impact this? How can I call out my friends? And then that was great and a huge success, but it doesn't stop there. As we all know, with behavior change, this is going to take a really long time. So the second piece was really about capability. We knew there were a huge number of men who were like, well, I've seen this happen. It's happened with my friends. I've just not really known what to say in the moment, or does it feel like it might not be a safe situation for me to intervene, or so on. So we knew that there were a lot of men who wanted to take action but didn't know what to do. So that's where we wanted to focus on this new phase of the campaign, where it's really tackling that capability side of behavior change. How do we equip men, give them the tools? What if we could come up with the answer of what is the thing you say in that moment? What is the thing that you're going to do that's going to help to tackle that behavior?
So in the first campaign, we told men to have a word. We then needed to understand what that word should be. Should it be a word? Should it be an action? David, you led the research. Can you tell us a little bit how we start to understand misogyny, what some of the methodologies we need to use?
Sure. So, word of the day, messy. We came into this knowing it was just an absolutely enormous task ahead of us. It's probably the hardest thing I've ever worked on, because we found that immediately no one really has a clear distinction of where is the line between harm and humour, because banter is a huge part of this. So what was really essential for us, actually, was to understand male dynamics and kind of go to male-dominated spaces. This was not going to be something that we could only rely on research reports and papers, which still formed a part of it, but actually a huge component of our sort of diagnosis phase was ethnography, which, if you're unfamiliar, is a type of research where you go to a natural environment and you observe it, you observe behavior. And in this particular case, we were also participating with the people. So we spoke to hedge fund managers in their local pub, the city bars. We went to gyms, the very rough end, all the way to your £400 a month gyms. We spoke to barbers, we spoke to swimming teachers, really, a whole diversity of London men to understand, well, what is preventing you from speaking up when your mate is stepping out? And so that was one part of it, ethnography. But we actually used some of our partners here quite extensively. So with the inter-panel research, that's a different kind of video diary type research where, we could actually talk to men on their sofas. One of them was actually on the loo, as they talked very honestly about quite tough subjects, and because we're always trying to get around that social desirability bias. So We found Instapanel was fantastic for that. But once we had these really confessional diaries of men talking about the challenges they feel, dynamics, we then actually put it through Relative Insight, which is another partner who we just love working with, because that gave us a whole new level of insight that we just wouldn't have had. So, for example, we put every single, I think 300 videos of men speaking, and we could put it through, and we could find tiny differences in ethnicities, for example, or age groups, how they talked about it. We found, for example, in certain cultures, misogyny and being bad, it was more of an awkward issue. I think that was the white cohort. Whereas in other ethnicities, it was seen as quite a rude thing. And so, subtle distinctions. But then, in particular, we found a 25.2 times increase in words associated with respect with our black cohort. So we started to really understand, well, what are the barriers and what are the rules and the sort of trigger points to which men decide there is a line and we should step in.
What are some of the challenges we talk about psychological safe spaces? Like, what are the challenges for men to talk freely? Can you talk us through some of that?
I mean, social dynamics was a huge part of this, and that's again why we had to do it in person, because we had to understand when one mate was saying something like, oh yeah, I really believe this, and then his mate would be like, hang on mate, what was that last Wednesday? And we could observe all these dynamics. I think another challenge with this, which is one we came into, was actually shame and understanding respect and all of those dynamics, because no mate wants to call out his mate is kind of the truth of this, because you went to school with them. So I think that's another real big challenge.
And what were some of we discussed what some of the hypotheses were, even at the early stages when we were talking to the project, we thought there were some hypotheses we wanted to test. What were some of the things that surprised us, Puja?
Yeah, so I think one of the hypotheses for me had been, are we going to need something in the moment? Are men going to want to call this out in the moment, or might they want to do it kind of separately? Might you take it offline and have a conversation? I guess sometimes your hypotheses are based on what you do. I might, talk to a friend afterwards and be like, hey, I didn't like that thing you said. And it was really, that was one of the hypotheses is, are we going to need an intervention for the moment, immediately when it happens, that's something you say or do then, or is it going to be something that's afterwards? So I think one thing that really surprised me that came out of that research was really almost kind of definitively and uniformly, everyone was like, no, we want something in the moment. And actually, looking back on that, you think, yeah, that makes sense, because actually pulling it up a lot later makes it feel like a bigger deal than just dealing with it in the moment. So that was a really interesting finding and surprise. And then one of the other ones for me, I think, was around, I think one of the lines that came out that I remember when David presented it back that always stuck with me was, it's easier to be offensive in a friendship group than it is to be offended, because you don't want to come across like you've been offended by something, and it kind of, you don't want to be seen as the person who's policing that group almost. So I think that was really fascinating, was one showed the kind of the scale of the issue of what we were dealing with, and then thinking, well, how are you going to find an intervention that basically says, I need to tell you this thing you did isn't cool, but I'm not offended by it, but it's not okay. And that's where some of the stuff that we'll talk a bit about was about how you introduce, in the strategy, how you introduce levity and lightness in doing it, and that was a really, really interesting part of that.
So we have our findings, and David, maybe just a kind of couple of words on what were the kind of key findings that we had.
We really pulled out 7 big ones, and then beneath that there was several strategic opportunities. But I think the main one, honestly, was just about respect. Because if you think about it, we are influencing a bystander to influence a perpetrator. So we can't shame either of these people, because you then get what we call psychological reactance, which is that feeling of being told off, which is just a wholly unproductive thing. People don't behave when you do things like that. And I remember actually when we were doing the ethnography in the pub, because that was essential to talk to bar staff, I think I went to the loo, and people who I was researching with, I came back and he's like, David, I've cracked it. It's all about love. I was like, come on, top it. Like,
which is an insight you usually find in the pub as well.
And it was like, this is probably 3 or 4 pints in on a Wednesday afternoon. But then we explained it, and we found actually, yes, it is about love. It's about respect. You went to school with these people. I think that was a really foundational part of the report in the end.
So, Bianca, we have our findings. How do you take them into a creative strategy? What are some of the decisions that you have to make? Can you talk us through that?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think a lot of the insights, Puja, David, they touched on it already, but it was very natural. So the strategy for phase 2 was a natural evolution from our strategy for phase 1, have a word. And the same way that we did last year, our strategy, the creative strategy, had the insights from behavioral science and the research and the COMBI model at its heart. So it was at the heart of our creative strategy. But one key insight that we got from the research this year was that actually, while men really wanted to intervene, and they knew that they had to, they didn't know why. They didn't know how. So we saw that 85% of men that saw our Have a Word campaign last year, they say that they would now call out misogyny when they saw it. But actually, they didn't know how, because it's really hard to know what to say and what to do when you see your friend behaving badly towards a woman. So yeah, the main conclusion and from that insight is that this new phase had to be about enabling, because the main barrier to intervention was actually capability. So what we had to do is to provide these bystanders with tools that would actually move bystanders to actually calling out misogyny when they saw it. But another key insight that we also got from the research was the fact that, same way as we were doing in the first phase, we had to continue to use the power of peer-to-peer pressure to drive behavior change. Because we listen to our friends, we trust our friends, and shaming and naming and calling of your friends and telling them off doesn't really work. So if we wanted our strategy to work effectively, that intervention had to come from a place of respect for that friendship. So we really needed to provide men with a simple but really powerful tool to start calling out their friends with respect and levity. So that was actually our main strategy. You have a lovely get to buy here as any good strategy. But yeah, but the essence of that strategy was calling it out with respect and coming with an intervention that really allowed men and bystanders to call out their friends with levity and respect.
And that led us to
our intervention, yeah. So of course then collaboratively with the team at Ogilvy and with our clients, we've developed that the intervention, which is quite a simple but powerful intervention that consists of a really small word, but that packs a lot of power and a lot of impact, and that word is mate. So the powerful thing about that word is that it's really accessible. So anyone can say it, but also it's universal. Anyone understands it. But what's more powerful about it is that it comes from that place of respect. And that bond, it really emphasizes that bond between friends, the bond of that friendship. So, yeah, mate, it's a very simple, again, but a very powerful intervention. And what's really powerful about that is not just the choice of words, but we had a lot of thinking and behavioral science behind how we activate that intervention. And I think David can.
I think we see on screen, David, quickly. I mean, we're not great for time, but a couple more minutes would be awesome. Yeah. Just to quickly talk about the insight and then.
Yeah, sure. So, mate, it's a word we already use. Men are using it already to govern themselves, but we found there's a huge difference between going mate, which is quite staccato, and it's quite harsh actually in the context where you're not trying to rock the boat. But we found actually when you lengthen those vowels and you make it mate with a bit more care to it, that you really feel it. And I think when we spoke to linguists, we read some papers on it, and we found that actually it's called vowel lengthening. Turns out whales do it, turns out birds do it too. It's a way to sort of add meaning to something, just lengthen that vowel a bit. kind of like ooh versus ooh, or no versus no, and you drop something, it adds meaning. But actually another thing was the T sound in there was very powerful because, again, when you hear that staccato T, that means your mate's being serious. It was fun, it was banter, but a line has now been crossed. So in the linguistics of it, just the intervention, which is really the product now, we then need to launch it.
And we do this, so the campaign, Say Mate to a Mate, we actually do this not through traditional means. We wanted to work with authentic voices who could get this word out for us. So essentially, Ramesh Ranganathan here, you see, he just took the word, he used it himself in a skit. We are now at time, but I would just love one word from Puja to say, just the challenges of how you might launch an intervention which you might not know what it is at the start of the project, but you have to sell it internally.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we talked a lot about the challenges around this one, because at the start it was like, is this going to be a word? Is it going to be a song? Is it going to be an action? It could be absolutely anything. So it was really about, one, kind of the trust between the agency and client relationship. I think that was absolutely critical. You know, we were very communicative about these are our absolute no-goes, the mandatories, you know, what we need. We were very involved in the creative process, you know, invited with the switch-ups and so on. And I think that was really, really important, because whenever you're doing behavior change work, it is a risk. It requires a lot of trust, senior buy-in, a lot of kind of that, you know, you're not going to get results immediately with a lot of this work. We know that the impact of this is going to be felt in generations to come, so our KPIs quite often are proxy ones. It's, you know, how many schools have we got this into, or how many partners have we got on board, as well as the indicative polling measures. So yeah, I think that's been really critical, and it's been very lucky, you know, this is a massive issue for the Mayor of London, so it's been a really useful to have that really senior buy-in and saying, you know we won't see results absolutely immediately, but even when we don't know what the intervention is, you know, having to go and be like, yeah, this is gonna be something, it's going to be great, don't know what it is yet, but it will stop, you know, it's going to be able to be used to stop misogyny. And I think that's the power in the use of the word mate, is it starts that conversation.
Okay, it's now in culture, we're launching with a campaign. Marianne Seacart said earlier, the easiest way to reduce inequality is if we see misogyny and sexism and racism, we call it out in the moment. Hopefully, this is a small step in doing that. Thank you.